Tunic is a game that I spent around 20 hours with about a year ago, and while there were brief moments of extreme frustration, it was a largely enjoyable experience. It wasn't until recently, however, when playing Alan Wake 2 that I began to think more seriously about developer intention in video games, and this ultimately brought me back to Tunic. The game's central idea is a good one. Its intention is to be a return to the style of games that released when the video game medium was still in its infancy, games like the first Legend of Zelda, for example. More specifically, though, Tunic's goal was to emulate two core aspects of those experiences. First, the aura of mystery present within minigames of that era, and then second, the challenge that often came with attempting to decipher those same mysteries. I am happy to report that Tunic is incredibly successful in both of these regards, and if this sounds interesting to you, I would recommend you stop watching this video immediately and go play the game for yourself. The central mechanic introduced in the game's final third is something that can only be truly experienced once, so know that if you decide to play the game later after watching this video, you will have had one of the game's best moments spoiled for you. There will be spoilers from here on. I was drawn to Tunic by its overt similarities to the Legend of Zelda series. These similarities are impossible to miss, and it's always one of the first things said about the game. Even if you haven't played Tunic for yourself, you've likely heard about the Zelda clone where you play as the fox. You wield a sword and shield, you open chests, there's a lantern for dark caves and bombs for blastable walls, skeletal and cold-blooded herps as enemies, there are themed dungeons that have themed bosses, an overworld that contains many different visually distinct areas, and even the areas present within that overworld match here. There's an opening, almost beginner forest, a series of dark caves, a snowy mountain, a deeper and darker forest, the insides of a volatile mountain. It's all very Zelda. Even the story, Tunic uses the concept of the hero being reborn through time as well. The game has you working to free a fox spirit that is later revealed to be a past version of yourself. The game manual pages you collect throughout have annotations from previous users, and part of the game even has you seeking out the graves of your past lives. Tunic's two endings see you either slay your past self and take his place, or breaking the cycle by causing the past version to remember its history via the game manual. The story of Tunic is surprisingly elegant in its minimalism, and it wasn't something I had expected to enjoy as much as I did. Many people applaud Tunic for being a wonderful return to that early era of Zelda, and I was initially among that group, but it's now that time in the video where the tone shift occurs. I enjoyed my time with Tunic, but I walked away from the experience with two major feelings. The first was how thankful I was that Nintendo largely stopped making Zelda games in this overly vague and cryptic format. I had expectations that this would be like Zelda, but I hadn't given much thought to what that meant, meaning which Zelda. The Legend of Zelda series can roughly be split into two categories based upon whether they utilize linear or non-linear design philosophies. The classification of the different games is actually something that's interesting in my opinion. Both the earlier games as well as the more recent games, Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, fall into that non-linear style, focused on exploration and allowing players to tackle the dungeons in any order they choose. These contrast to the middle era of games, Ocarina of Time, Twilight Princess, and Skyward Sword for example, that are more linear-based, meaning they have a strict game progression that players have to work through, and because of this curation typically have a much more in-depth narrative. Also, I realize that this video is supposed to be about Tunic, not Zelda, but I promise we're arriving at the point. I don't typically enjoy non-linear Zeldas. They aren't bad, I just prefer the more linear, puzzle, and narrative-focused ones that I grew up with. Tunic, despite actually being somewhat linear, shares more in common with the original Legend of Zelda and Breath of the Wild than it does any of the others, and you're now likely thinking, okay, duh. Of course, the game that is based on the original Zelda has the most in common with that entry, but walking away from the game, I felt almost misled by the claims that the game is like Zelda, and to be clear, that is not something I fault the game or the mini reviewers for. Tunic is like Zelda, just not my Zelda. Tunic is about exploration and the mysteries associated with it. It has none of the in depth puzzle and equipment use progression found in the more linear Zeldas, and outside of just one instance, in my opinion, it instead focuses on basic ideas. Using bombs to blast walls open, using the game's version of the hookshot to cross gaps, and pulling levers. The one exception to this was a one off puzzle for an extra endgame treasure that required you to figure out how to get up to a small ledge that had an enemy on it. There were no hidden paths to the alcove, and your hookshot can only pull enemies towards you. The manual has a drawing of the spot along with a scribbled note that you're seeing on screen. These are all drawings of items you get in the game, and eventually it clicked for me that maybe you could press the buttons for those two items at once, and lo and behold, that's what you do. It uses the long-range properties of the wand, but adds the freezing effect of the ice dagger. The enemy being frozen then creates a grapple point for the hookshot. This was excellent and was the escalation of puzzle concepts that I had been wanting the entire game. The final third of the game does introduce a new type of puzzle centered on something referred to in-game as the Holy Cross, and again, if anything you've heard or seen so far makes you think Tunic might be something you want to experience for yourself, then I would immediately stop this video. I'll give a couple extra seconds here for those that decide they want to do just that. The Holy Cross is a puzzle concept that requires the input of a specific button combination on the D-pad based on various line patterns found in the game world. This might be hard to visualize if you haven't played the game, so here's an example. What you're seeing on screen would be the most basic form of this puzzle, a door with a pattern on it. You start at the circle, and so the button inputs would be down, right, up, right. Entering this correctly with the D-pad sees the door open. I like the concept of this puzzle quite a lot. It recontextualizes the world and gives you something to look for as you traverse the same regions again. And look for these patterns you will, because they are everywhere, not just on doors. Solving these input line puzzles reward additional pages of the instruction manual, and so are required for players who wish to unlock the true ending. This style of puzzle culminates in what's referred to as the Golden Path, an extreme 100-input version of the line puzzle that involves the instruction manual itself. Select pages have yellow line patterns hidden on them, signifying they are part of the Golden Path puzzle. The manual gives the pages of each as well as the orientation of how they'll fit together, so you'll draw out the patterns and connect them into one giant line. I don't want to undersell this moment because it is an incredible holy shit moment when you connect the dots and realize what you're looking for. It's one of the best puzzles I've experienced in a game, which is probably a bit confusing to hear given I described the game as having no puzzle progression. Despite my enjoyment of this particular puzzle, both the Golden Path and the Holy Cross puzzles as a whole have serious problems. With the Golden Path, I largely applaud the intention and execution, but I also think it has way too much potential for player error with also no feedback given. You approach the giant stone door on the mountain where the instruction booklet tells you to go once you have the Golden Path complete, but there's no clearly marked location to stand for pressing the inputs. I actually tried my inputs multiple times in different spaces because it didn't work. Was it related to my location? Could be. It could also be because one of my directional presses didn't register, or because one of the D-pad buttons got stuck. Or maybe I didn't press the buttons fast enough, or maybe I pressed them too fast. If I did mess up a press, can I immediately start again, or do I need to leave the area and come back to reset the attempt? Because the required input is 100 directional button presses, and because there's absolutely no feedback given to players on whether they are making errors outside of the code solution you've created, it can become a bit frustrating. I actually looked up the solution online myself after several input attempts just to confirm that I had the code right. I did, and eventually was able to get the door unlocked, but have no idea what the causes of failure were. Since these are button input puzzles, there's only two ways in theory of making them more difficult: increasing the length of inputs and increasing the vagueness of the source. Tunic attempts to do both of these. You'll be tracking an enemy's direction as it walks, reading tile patterns on the ground, watching the rotating line reflections from a pool of water, observing flowers, and much, much more. The issue is that these don't really advance the concept of using line patterns and directional inputs because while the vagueness of the pattern changes, the concept doesn't. They all boil down to watching or noticing something, then tapping your D-pad. The mechanic is interesting, but it also doesn't evolve from its introduction to its ending with the golden path. With this design and style of puzzles, Tunic actually has more in common with a game like The Witness than it does The Legend of Zelda. Now, I originally said Tunic left me with two feelings after I finished it. Turning now to the second of these, it was that the best aspects of Tunic's experience for me were the parts where it stepped out from the shadow cast by the Legend of Zelda series and flexed its own muscles and style. The main ways it showcases its originality, in my opinion, are with its visuals, its instruction manual mechanic, and finally, its combat. I am not an artist, but I do think it's reasonable to say that Tunic's visuals are impressive. They feature a wide variety of color palettes from natural greens to synthetic pinks to crisp blues, all wrapped in a minimalist style. Tunic at first glance appears to be a cute version of the stereotypical fantasy biomes we see in Zelda, but it's actually more complex than that, and these visuals and styles are what allow Tunic to break the mold. The snowy mountain setting is actually complemented by an industrial mining theming, complete with a toxic waste and Mad Max-style rabbit enemies wielding grenades and sniper rifles. The Dark Woods are home to an almost cult-like organization that protects the vault that serves as the area's dungeon. These locations are all interesting and don't feel like they could exist in a Zelda. The instruction manual is another concept that wouldn't work in a traditional Zelda, specifically because it represents the real physical booklets that came with games during that era. The limitations of technology during the early years of the gaming industry restricted what developers could convey to players within a game, which often led to games appearing quite mysterious. Instruction manuals were included with games in order to combat this, providing developers a means of explaining things to players that they couldn't do within the game. As time went on, methods of communicating in-game advanced, and because of this, we saw the slow death of the instruction booklet that accompanied games. The instruction manual mechanic alone makes this game worth playing, in my opinion, and it is the part of the game that shines the brightest. It is apparent how deliberate the developer Andrew Schuldice was with its crafting. Everything from the organization of information on the pages to how and what it reveals, as well as how and when specific pages would be obtainable, is thought through. Many of the earlier pages are smartly structured and get double usage, as later pages add new context or further understanding to the original information present on them. Each page is also front and back, meaning you often get previews of upcoming regions of the map or enemies, and this further adds to the excitement of discovery. Finally, we have the combat. The player's half of this experience is a bit simple. The mechanics aren't expanded upon much throughout the game, as they're clearly replicating the simplicity of The Legend of Zelda. You attack with your sword, block with your shield, and can do a dodge roll out of the way. These will largely be what you're using the entire game, as none of the equipment or items feel like they were designed to be viable to exclusively play with. There are a lot of interesting mechanics in Tunic's combat, however. For instance, when you die, you leave behind a specter containing some of your currency, and you respawn at the most recent save shrine you interacted with. Your health potions replenish after you die, but so too do all of the enemies. You must fight your way back to your ghost in order to recollect your currency. In addition to health and mana for your items, you also have a stamina bar that drains when you either dodge roll or block an attack with your shield, meaning you have to be deliberate with your actions during combat. This is all quite new and innovative, and as a combat system, I think it's ripe for expansion. I hope every game for the next decade replicates this combat formula and we get some sort of new genre based on its fundamentals. It could be called Tunic-likes or something like that. Listen, yes, I know this game's combat is based on Dark Souls, I'm just being a shithead. Like with Zelda, this comparison for the combat was mentioned in every review of the game. If you've watched other videos on this channel, then you know I'm not a big fan of the Souls series, yet for some reason, Tunic's combat still worked for me, like with Death's Door and Hyper Light Drifter before it. The simplified Souls-like mechanics were good, but what made combat particularly enjoyable for me were the enemy and boss designs. Every region had at least one, but usually two or more unique enemies. The Deep Forest had spiders and then several variants of the cultists. The West Gardens had the crocodile-type enemies and the little blaster robots. The swamp had the Zelda Stolfos as well as the invisible fox ghosts. There's a part later in the game where you need to go through an intense and long combat gauntlet in order to earn an item called the Hero's Crown. This gauntlet is the game's combat version of the Golden Path input puzzle. There are 6 different waves of enemies you'll need to beat, but you can select them in whichever order you want, and along with this, there's a 7th wave that replenishes your health and healing potions, again to be activated whenever you choose. This is the sequence that convinced me Tunic had achieved something with its enemy diversity because it required me to think about how best to tackle each of the enemy types, and it felt like the side items like the fire wand or the bombs could be actually utilized during combat in a substantial way. The enemy design is surprisingly good, and luckily the bosses were even better. The game features 6 bosses divided among the game's 3 acts. 2 guard the bell towers of Act 1, 3 you fight for the gemstones in Act 2, and then there's the final boss of Act 3. In all of these encounters except one, it felt like natural escalation in terms of difficulty and complexity. Both the guard captain and the garden knight are early level bosses that serve as checks that you know the basics of combat, and both reappear in the combat gauntlet I mentioned but made more difficult. Of the middle 3, the librarian and the boss scavenger continue the progression of difficulty and were my 2 favorite boss encounters of the game. The siege engine in terms of design is visually interesting, but the encounter design didn't have as much thought put into it. The boss has a mechanic where it reveals a hanging glowing generator, and I presume this is meant to be the weak point, and perhaps players are meant to stay out of range, avoiding damage until it's revealed, and then they approach to deliver a bit of damage themselves. If this was the intention for the fight, it didn't end up being the outcome. The engine's enormous design works against it. Its many long-range attacks can't hit you if you stay close, and it lacks a hard-hitting close-range attack to punish you for being in close. Playing aggressively in the machine's face allowed you to continue dealing damage without a way for it to counter. It's the only boss that felt misplaced with both what came before it and what came after, as it's quite easy. There are only 6 boss encounters, so having even one of them be mechanically underwhelming feels disappointing, but fortunately, each of the bosses that follow more than make up for it by being very difficult. In particular, both the scavenger boss and the heir have a wide variety of moves that can hit at different distances, so they require that the player learn telegraphs and understand how to correctly avoid the attacks while also setting themselves up to counter. It came as a surprise to me that Tunic's combat is one of the most criticized parts of the game because I found it to be one of the highlights. Now, I don't want to discuss possible areas for improvement much in this video because I personally hope there isn't a sequel. Tunic's standout mechanic, the instruction manual, really only works once, at least in this sort of game, and I don't think a repeat, even if it's clever, will capture the same feelings. Rather than see a continuation or expansion of Tunic in a sequel, I'd rather see the developer take these ideas and bring them to other games from those early eras of gaming. I personally would love to see a Tunic-styled riff on the Mega Man format, as I consider the original X to not just be one of the greatest games of that era, but also just ever. It's a style of game that I don't think gets the modern attention that it should. There aren't many games coming out nowadays that try to innovate on this particular format, and instead we just get more and more Souls-likes. I think this would actually be a really interesting thing to see a studio do, focus on reinventing classic series with each of their games. Despite my criticisms of Tunic and feeling misled, I'm actually glad it had the Zelda window dressing because that's what initially drew me in and is ultimately what I ended up appreciating about it the least. I went in with expectations of the experience I was going to get, and what I got was worse in some ways, but better in many more. Thanks for watching.